The Renaissance was one of the most extraordinary turning points in human history, an age when Europe seemed to awaken from centuries of stagnation and step into a new world of art, science, philosophy, and ambition. The word Renaissance means rebirth, and that is exactly how later generations described it. A rebirth of knowledge, creativity, and classical learning after the Middle Ages. But to truly understand the Renaissance, we need to imagine walking through its streets, hearing the sounds of hammering workshops, smelling fresh ink from printing presses, and seeing brilliant minds reshape civilization in real time. This was not just a movement of paintings and sculptures. It was a complete transformation of how people saw themselves and their place in the universe. It began in the wealthy city-states of Italy during the 14th century, especially in cities like Florence, Venice, and Rome, where trade created enormous fortunes and competition fueled innovation. Merchants, bankers, and noble families spent their wealth on grand buildings, libraries, and artists, turning cities into cultural battlegrounds where prestige was won through beauty and intellect. To understand why the Renaissance began in Italy, we must look at geography and economics. Italy stood at the center of Mediterranean trade routes connecting Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Goods like silk, spices, and precious metals flowed through Italian ports, enriching powerful families, such as the Medici family. The Medici became famous patrons of art and scholarship, funding painters, architects, and philosophers. Their support transformed Florence into the beating heart of Renaissance culture. At the same time, the ruins of ancient Roman Empire surrounded Italians every day. Broken columns, statues, and forgotten manuscripts reminded scholars of a glorious past worth rediscovering. Renaissance thinkers believed the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome could guide a better future. They studied classical texts, copied manuscripts, and revived ideals of logic, balance, and human potential. One of the greatest intellectual changes of the Renaissance was the rise of humanism. Humanism was a philosophy that focused on human achievement, reason, and education rather than only religious authority. Medieval life had often centered on preparing for the afterlife, but Renaissance humanists argued that life on Earth also mattered deeply. Scholars like Petrarch searched monasteries for lost Roman writings and celebrated literature that explored emotion, politics, and ethics. Education expanded beyond theology into grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy. This did not mean religion disappeared. Europe remained deeply Christian, but people increasingly believed that God had given humanity the ability to create, discover, and improve the world. It was a subtle shift with enormous consequences. Art became the most visible symbol of the Renaissance. Medieval paintings often appeared flat and symbolic, but Renaissance artists pursued realism, anatomy, perspective, and emotion. In Florence, Leonardo da Vinci studied muscles, light engineering, and nature, blending science with imagination. His works, including the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, remain among the most famous in history. Michelangelo created the towering statue of David and painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel with scenes of astonishing power. Raphael produced graceful masterpieces, such as the School of Athens, which gathered ancient philosophers in an idealized architectural space. These artists were not seen merely as craftsmen anymore. They became celebrities, intellectuals, and symbols of genius. The Renaissance was also a scientific awakening. Curiosity about nature encouraged observation and experimentation. Leonardo da Vinci filled notebooks with studies of flying machines, water systems, and human anatomy. Later thinkers challenged old assumptions about the cosmos. Nicholas Copernicus argued that the Earth revolved around the Sun, a radical idea that shook centuries of accepted belief. Galileo Galilei used telescopes to gather evidence supporting new astronomical theories. Though some of these figures belong slightly after the core Renaissance period, their breakthroughs were made possible by the intellectual spirit the Renaissance created. Question tradition, observe reality, and trust evidence. Another revolutionary force was the printing press. Around 1450, Johannes Gutenberg developed movable type printing in Europe. Before printing, books were copied by hand and were rare, expensive, and slow to produce. Printing changed everything. Knowledge could now spread rapidly across borders. Scholars exchanged ideas faster, literacy increased, and ordinary people gained access to texts once reserved for elites. Classical works, scientific treatises, maps, and religious writings circulated widely. This communication network accelerated change in ways earlier generations could never imagine. Politics during the Renaissance could be ruthless. While artists painted beauty, rulers fought wars, plotted alliances, and sought power. Italian city-states competed constantly. Mercenary armies marched through the peninsula, and foreign powers such as France and Spain intervened in Italian affairs. In this tense world, Niccolò Machiavelli wrote The Prince, one of history's most famous political works. Rather than describing ideal morality, Machiavelli examined how rulers actually gain and keep power. His name later became associated with cold political realism. The Renaissance did not remain only in Italy. It spread northward into France, Germany, England, and the Low Countries. Northern Renaissance thinkers blended Italian humanism with local religious concerns. Erasmus promoted education, and church reform through wit and scholarship. William Shakespeare, though later, reflected Renaissance themes of psychology, ambition, love, and human complexity in drama that still dominates world literature. Painters in the North developed stunning detail through oil techniques, creating lifelike portraits and scenes of everyday life. Yet the Renaissance was not perfect. Wealth and creativity often depended on inequality. Women had limited access to education and power, though exceptional figures such as Isabella d'Este played major cultural roles. Many peasants saw little of elite artistic glory. Europe also faced plague, warfare, and religious conflict. Still, despite its contradictions, the Renaissance changed the trajectory of civilization. It helped pave the way for the scientific revolution, global exploration, modern education, and new political thought. When we speak of AI Reconstruction today, we are trying to visualize this lost world, not as static museum images, but as living streets filled with merchants, apprentices, scholars, priests, bankers, and artists. Imagine sunrise over Florence as bells ring across tiled rooftops. Imagine marble dust in Michelangelo's workshop. Imagine crowded Venetian canals loaded with goods from distant lands. Imagine the hush of a library where forgotten manuscripts are open for the first time in centuries. The Renaissance was not merely an era of masterpieces. It was the moment humanity rediscovered confidence in its own potential. Its legacy surrounds us in our universities, our science, our politics, our architecture, and our belief that knowledge can transform the world. Even now, centuries later, we still live in the shadow and the light of the Renaissance.